Andrew Williams, New Pacific Metals. I'm the president of the company. I joined 2 months ago. Previous to New Pacific Metals, I spent 11 years on the buy side at an institutional precious metals investment firm. Most recently as a precious metals analyst. And I made the jump in industry because of this fantastic opportunity at New Pacific, a company that's discovering and developing world-class silver and gold deposits in Bolivia. And on this introductory slide is a nice photo of our flagship silver sand project. It's the one that brought us to Bolivia in 2017 and has emerged into one of the most significant global primary silver discoveries of this past decade. So why New Pacific? We've got 3 projects all in Bolivia. The most advanced is the Silver Sand project on the left side of the screen, which is a large silver deposit that can be mined by open pit mining methods and processed using tank leaching. And early in January of this year, we released our preliminary economic assessment, highlighting a 4 million ton per year throughput rate, producing 171 million ounces of payable silver over a 14-year life, yielding an after-tax net present value of $726 million and a 39% IRR. This year, we're heavily engaged in permitting our Silver Sand project and hope to be bringing it one step closer to being ready to finance and build, which will be an exciting and monumental occasion for the company. And Silver Sand is a company-making project in and of itself, but if that wasn't a tough enough act to follow, in the second half of 2021, the company began drilling its second project, Carangas, located in the middle of this slide. And we drilled 150 holes so far at Carangas to the end of 2022 in 64,000 meters. And what we've discovered is a 1,000-meter long by 800-meter wide silver horizon, and overlying a broad gold zone beneath that. And that gold zone and the discovery there has really changed the game for us at Carangas. And so this year, our program is to drill 15,000 meters at Carangas with 5 rigs and then complete our inaugural mineral resource estimate by the middle of this year, and then follow that up with a preliminary economic assessment by the end of this year. So Carangas is exciting, it's big, and it's moving fast. And our third project, last but not least, on the right-hand side of this slide is Silverstrike, which we started drilling it last year with a modest scout program, and we discovered a 200-meter thick near-surface oxidized gold zone of 1 gram per ton during that drilling program, and consider Silverstrike to be prospective for both Silver Sand and Carangas styles of mineralization. So what are we up to this year? Well, at our Silver Sand project, our goal is to complete a pre-feasibility study by the middle of this year. As I mentioned, we released our preliminary economic assessment at the start of this year. So we're going to tighten up a number of those assumptions, and we're completing ongoing technical work to bring that up to the rigor required of a full pre-feasibility study by the middle of this year. And as I mentioned, we're also working to complete our environmental impact assessment study, which will be a major milestone for the Silver Sand project. And then the ultimate goal is to obtain the environmental impact statement. And then finally, we're working with Comabol, which is the state-owned mining company in Bolivia, to obtain the ratification and approval of an already signed mining production contract that will unlock an additional 55 square kilometers of exploration ground surrounding our Silver Sand tenements. And then at Carangas, as I mentioned, our goal this year is to complete a 15,000-meter drill program by the end of this quarter, which should be ending this week, to extend the deep gold mineralization to the northeast and continue stepping out on the shallow silver mineralization to the southwest of the area that we've drilled off. And then use that drilling. We'll have roughly 180 holes in roughly 80,000 meters of drilling to complete our inaugural resource estimate by the middle of this year, and then roll that into a preliminary economic assessment by year end. And so this time next year, the Carangas project will be at the same stage that Silver Sand is today. So we're rapidly advancing that project, and that's ultimately how we can create such great value for our shareholders. In this business, time is money. And lastly, at Silverstrike, given how much we've got on our plate at both Silver Sand and Carangas for a company of our size, we've decided to pause exploration activities this year so that we can really focus on delivering on our important objectives at both Silver Sand and Carangas. This by no means underscores the geological potential at Silverstrike. We made the strategic decision as a company that it's in our best interest to really do what we have in front of us right at Silver Sand and Carangas, and look for us to pick Silverstrike up again, back when our internal conditions warrant. So how have we been so successful operating in Bolivia? The first bullet point suggests that we can't take all the credit for it because the geology in this country is unbelievable. Bolivia is home to the 3 billion ounce Cerro Rico silver deposit, which is one that's been continuously operating since 1545. We're also on trend with Peru, Chile, and Argentina, which are 3 countries that host not only some of the world's great deposits, but some of the world's great mines. And we know that Mother Nature doesn't tend to respect man-made borders when depositing metals. A second point that is really important to understand about Bolivia is there's a deep mining culture in the country. Mining's responsible for 30% of the national economy. It's deeply ingrained in the country's DNA. Harking back to 500 years, the Cerro Rico deposit, and right up to today, mining is an essential part of the national economy. And in 2021, Bolivia ranked as the 8th largest silver producer globally. And then the third bullet point is probably the one most important for us, is that the country has been greatly underexplored in the last 20 years. When we came into the country in 2017, there were really no other juniors operating in earnest in the country, and today there's half dozen to 10 different juniors that are operating in the country, largely in the wake of the success that we've had at Silver Sand and most recently at Carangas. And when we came in and made the Silver Sand discovery, we're really proud of using that discovery, which helped us to earn a reputation in the country as someone that's a reliable and trustworthy partner. And then we rolled that first mover advantage up and were able to acquire both Carangas and Silverstrike, and Carangas really being the latest project to bear significant fruit from those relationships and the in-country know-how that we've developed as a company. So zooming into our Silver Sand project, the Silver Sand is nested in a 3 square kilometer administrative mining contract, which grants us the right to mine. As I mentioned, though, we still need to obtain our environmental impact statement, which is something that we're working on in earnest this year. And we drilled 136,000 meters in Silver Sand, 550 holes in the 5-year span from 2017 to 2022. So we've drilled the heck out of this thing, and that database forms the basis on which we released not only our first resource estimate, but more importantly, that entire data set was used in our updated resource that we released in the fall of last year. And then that updated resource, which I'll show you on a subsequent slide, underpinned our preliminary economic assessment that we released on January 9th of this year. This 5250 cross-section gives you a nice overview of what we're dealing with geologically at Silver Sand. It's a broad disseminated fracture network. We're not chasing half-meter wide, high-grade, narrow nuggety veins as a broad disseminated bulk system that we've drilled extensively. There are areas of this deposit that we've drilled down to 5 by 5 meter spacing in order to really satisfy the most critical of QPs for our resource estimate. And another important point to note from this cross section is that the bulk of this mineralization comes right to surface. The green Tarapaya formation on the top right portion of the slide acts as an impermeable cap that stopped fluid flow from migrating from beneath, and effectively that contact then allowed the silver-bearing mineralized fluids to pool in and around that contact and preserve such a wonderful deposit so close to surface. This next slide gives you a broad overview of our updated resource estimate as compared to our 2019 resource estimate. In bold in the middle of our screen, the 2022 estimate, 201.8 million ounces of silver in measured and indicated, which is an important point to emphasize that, as I mentioned, this preliminary economic assessment was based on the 2022 resource estimate, and over 90% of that PEA was based on measured and indicated, which in the junior mining space, one of the features of a PEA study is that you're allowed to use inferred mineralization, which often can form the bulk of most juniors' PEAs. But in our case, because we'd spent so much time and effort drilling the deposit, we had such a large measured and indicated resource inventory that almost all of our PEA study was based on measured and indicated resources. And the second point to highlight is that the grade. So 116 grams silver, as I mentioned, this is an open pittable deposit, which if we put that into gold equivalent terms, that's roughly 1.5 grams, which would make this one of the nicest open pits to come online for quite some time. And so this next slide gives you a nice overview of the technical parameters that were outlined in this study. So the first bullet point, or the first line item, is the strip ratio, 3.6 to 1, which is including a 18.5 million ton pre-strip. So when we're actually in operations, that number is going to be closer to 3 to 1. And a 4 million ton per annum plant, that's 12,000 tons per day operating over 14 years. So that size of a plant is well within the scope of a company of our size and scale to design, finance, and build internally, which is really important. It's a nice bite-sized, high-grade, high-impact project. For us, 107 grams per ton silver, as I mentioned, for open pit head grade. It's just an exceptionally high grade project for us, and it makes intuitive sense when you go through the strip ratio, the grade, the recoveries, 91%, tank leach Merrill-Crowe, why this project delivers such robust economics. And we ran this study at $22.50 silver, which I think is it's in and around where the silver price is today. And the study yielded an after-tax net present value of $726 million US and a 39% after-tax IRR, which is well in excess of any reasonable hurdle rate that one would use to evaluate a construction decision on a project like this. A couple other points to highlight. Mining cost, $9.55 per ton milled. We're going to go with a contractor mining operation, and as part of our pre-feasibility study, we're going to be obtaining specific quotes from potential mining contractors. So look for us to sharpen that number up in the pre-feasibility study. Processing costs, that includes tailings dewatering, and we'll get into our tailings disposal methodology on the next slide. But one thing to note is in Bolivia, the power costs, which is often the bulk of the processing costs in any operation, our power cost is US 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that was a quotation from a local supplier. So another contributor to why our cost structure is so competitive at the operation. And sub $2 a ton G&A, which is a number that benchmarks well against comparable operations in the country. And that all contributes to an operating cash cost of roughly $8.50 an ounce and an all-in sustaining cost of just a little over $10 an ounce silver. So an incredibly cost-competitive project at Silver Sand as outlined in our preliminary economic assessment. And the other point that we didn't touch on that last slide, which is a point that I'm particularly proud of as someone that's responsible for going out and coordinating project financing, is that in given the strong production profile in the first 4 years, as we can see on this chart, 16 million ounces per year of silver, the after-tax payback period on this project is under 2 years. And that, to put this silver production profile into perspective, 16 million ounces per year is what silver industry giant Hecla is guiding this year in their silver guidance, from 16 to 17.5 million ounces from their 3 primary silver mines combined. So that these first 4 years are going to be substantial, and that's driven by generally some higher grades that we're fortunate to be able to access in the heart of the deposit early on, and then we get into a bit of a stripping campaign in the middle section of the mine life, and then things pick up again in the back half. But this is exactly the kind of production profile where we can have rapid cash flow and payback in the early years of the mine life. That is a really special attribute of the Silver Sand project. So the capex, $308 million initially, life of mine, $327 million. For a company of our size and our market cap, which is in and around $350, $400 million US, this is an entirely financeable project for a company like us. The biggest piece in there is the processing plant, which is that 12,000 tons per day, processing plant, 4 million tons per annum. And then the next biggest component is the pre-strip. So that'll be contractor, 18.5 million tons times our roughly $2 and change. Material movement cost gives us the $47 million pre-strip. Because we're going with a contractor, we're not bearing the upfront capital cost associated with a fleet. So there are significant capital cost savings there by going with a contractor. The next biggest piece in the capital cost estimate is site infrastructure. And if we zoom into that, $47 million, the biggest chunk is we have to bring a power line to site, 20, 30 Ks, nothing extraordinary or significantly complex, but we have to bring it to site nonetheless. And there's also a water reservoir that we need to build to capture excess rainwater for use in our processing plant. There's also some interesting positive social benefits that come from that engineered solution. So that's a really elegant feature of this project, is that there really is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minimal infrastructure required. Tailings facility is the fourth largest item on that list, $25 million. So we've gone with a dry stack tailings facility, which the downside is that you bear a significant upfront capital cost, but the upside is that from an ecological perspective, it's by far the most benign solution. It significantly cuts down on the project's water consumption. It also significantly reduces the footprint required from the site itself, because we dewater the tailings before we dispose of them, and so the volume is significantly less. And it also offers a much more robust and stable long-term storage solution from a geotechnical perspective. So it ticks all the boxes, and it made sense for us to go with the dry stack tailings for this site. And then the final piece is that because we spend the capital early and we're disposing this dry cake material in our waste facility, is that we don't have to incur the ongoing tailings dam lifts, which are often a significant component of sustaining capital in any modern open pit mining operation. So I mentioned that we got the power quote from a local supplier. And then there's also elements of the large elements of the processing plant, equipment, and tailings facility that we sourced quotes from global suppliers on. So again, these are numbers that we're continuing to hone on the pre-feasibility study, but nonetheless, we're very pleased with how they came out in this preliminary economic assessment. And then I think this is our last slide on Silver Sand, which gives you a nice overview of the outline of the infrastructure facility. So in purple is the main pit, which hosts 97% of the silver from that one pit, and then there's little bits and pieces that come from the rest of them. Our integrated waste dump and tailings disposal facility in orange at the bottom of the screen. You can see in gray in the middle of the image is our process plant. Site access road in green. So again, going 20 to 30 kilometers south of the page here, we get a paved national highway. So the access is outstanding. The green road, we're going to just have to complete minimal upgrades on in certain sections, but I've taken that road straight to site. And so it's another feature that we're incredibly blessed with at this project. And then lastly, there's the water reservoir, which I mentioned. So you can see in blue in the middle of the image is we're going to build a roughly 3 million cubic meter water reservoir. And in the Silver Sand project area, there's a very wet season, which lasts for a few months of the year, and then a very dry season, which lasts for the remaining 8-9 months of the year. And so in the very wet season, there's almost a meter's worth of rain that falls, and so there's too much rain for the local ecosystem to handle, and so most of it ends up flushing away, getting unused, and ending up in the ocean eventually. And then the rest of the year, there's not enough water for folks to be able to use. And so you get this boom-bust cycle. So our water reservoir, what it's going to do is capture excess rainwater so that we can use it continuously throughout the year in our process plant. But importantly, during the dry parts of the year, when the local communities are struggling for water access, we're going to be able to release excess water to them for their consumption. So it's a really elegant solution for water at the Silver Sand project. So moving into Carangas. So Carangas is a project, our next big project, and we started drilling it in the middle of 2021, a very modest program that quickly blossomed into a full-scale assault with the drills. We had 5 drill rigs running throughout last year and continue to have 5 rigs running today. And up to the end of last year, we drilled 64,000 meters. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we've got, once we add our existing drilling, we're going to have almost 80,000 meters of drilling in roughly 180 drill holes at Carangas. And every hole we've drilled at Carangas has intercepted that silver horizon near surface, and we've continuously hit gold mineralization in the Central Valley, and I'll give you a nice overview of the flavor of that zonation in a subsequent slide. But what we've discovered at Carangas is this 1,000-meter long by 800-meter wide silver horizon at surface that's up to 200 meters thick, and that silver horizon is stacked above a thick gold system hosted in a rhyolite intrusive. So this year, we're going to continue our last drill program before our inaugural resource estimate, and that's going to be finishing up this week. And then we look to publish that resource estimate by the middle of this year. So for the first time, we can showcase and quantify the importance of this Carangas discovery that we've been screaming at the tops of our lungs to the investment community to acknowledge just how significant this thing is. And then by the end of this year, we're going to take that resource estimate and roll it into a preliminary economic assessment. So this slide here gives you the plan view map of Carangas. So the green outlines are where we've intersected this near surface silver horizon, and that's that 1 kilometer east-west footprint. And then we've also drilled a lot of these drill holes, especially in the silver zone, have been drilled from south to north at a shallow angle. And so that footprint on the north-south has been that 800 meters. And then the Central Valley, it wasn't until hole 31 that we had an idea that there might be a gold system beneath the silver horizon. And so hole 31, instead of just drilling this deposit at 45-degree angles, our geologists took a risk and they drilled 66-degree dip angle in the Central Valley, and that's where they discovered the gold zone at depth, which has really changed the game for us at Carangas. So Carangas itself, here, this gives you an overview of what the topography looks like. The top image, we're looking west at the West Dome, which is where Battle Mountain had drilled roughly 10 holes in the mid-90s. There's some outcropping brecciated silver mineralization that looks to be the most interesting attribute of this entire system. They drilled it 100 meters, 100 grams per ton silver. Gold's $5 an ounce in the 90s. They walked away. So when we picked the project up, and started drilling, we began at the West Dome and confirmed those hits. So roughly that 100 meters, 100 grams silver. And then on the bottom image, if you turn the camera around, you look at the East Dome, we drilled, you can see hole 9 there is the easternmost hole that was drilled. We confirmed silver mineralization in the East Dome and then drilled shallow holes in the Central Valley beneath the West and the East Dome, which is where we then connected this 1 kilometer long silver system. And then in the Central Valley, that's where we drilled the famous hole 31 into the gold system, which just really transformed this operation for us. So this gives you a nice cross section of what we're seeing in that with that zonation at Carangas. So the top, call it 200 meters, is where we get the silver plus some lead zinc in green. So hole 44 is one that we drilled in the middle of last year, going through the silver horizon in that top 200 meters, and then transitioning through a lead zinc zone, and then into this big gold system at depth. So we went into 514 meters at 1.1 grams gold, including an 87 meter interval, 2.57 grams per ton gold. And then we at the end of last year stepped out on hole 44 with hole 96, which is the hole on the right side of this image. And that's one that we released a few weeks ago to the market after receiving our assays and incorporating it in our internal checks. So we put that hole out, and it's a classic Carangas hole. So we go right through the silver horizon, this time with really good high impact silver grades, 164 meters, 94 grams silver, and then through the transitional lead zinc zone, and then into the gold zone at depth, exactly where we had interpreted the northeastern dip on this rhyolitic intrusive. Hit 520 meters, 1.24 grams per ton gold. Had a really nice high-grade subinterval, 50 meters, 4.5 grams per ton gold. And so we're going to continue stepping out as part of this program that's almost completed. We're going to continue stepping out to the northeast in the interpreted dip direction of this rhyolitic intrusive to continue expanding the gold zone. And we're continuing to step out to the southwest of the silver horizon, which is where our guys think that has the most potential for further expansion. And then we're also continuing to infill some of the parts, in particular near surface, to make sure that we've got enough drill density for our upcoming resource. But I think what this discovery reveals is that there is great potential in Bolivia to find gold and copper underneath some of the silver mineralization. Bolivia has predominantly been known to be a silver dominant geological area, and these gold deposits are a bit of a breakthrough geologically for the country. So I think we're really challenging existing geological dogma with these deep drill holes into the gold zone at Carangas. We're also just noting that there are some interesting geological similarities to Filo Mining's Filo del Sol project, which has an extensive silver horizon at surface, big footprint, and then they drilled at depth and hit the enriched gold and copper zone. A very similar story to what we've seen at Carangas. There's also regional exploration potential at Carangas. This is an older IP survey. We're currently completing a much broader survey in the district because we think that there's a potential that this could be one of several. That's a very interesting hypothesis that our guys are continuing to push forward. So it's incumbent on us to continue flushing out the ultimate potential of Carangas, and perhaps it's part of a larger district. So that's something to stay tuned for with us here. And then here's some photos of the core. It's hosted in a Volcana clastic unit for the geological buffs out there. And then I think this is an important point for us to touch on: the the metallurgical response, in particular the gold. So when we drilled the gold at depth, you never know if it's going to be free milling or refractory. So we ran this fatal flaw metallurgical test program early in the drill campaign, and we're thrilled to see that both less than 1% and less than 3% sulfur content gold both returned over 98% recoveries to a whole ore cyanide leach. So we're absolutely thrilled. We can continue to drill it without concern with whether or not it will or will not recover. And then in the silver lead zinc zone, we've also ran tests for both oxidized, semi-oxidized, and fresh, and get really strong recoveries. So we're again very blessed at Carangas for this to be metallurgically a well-behaved deposit. And last but not least, I'll just briefly touch on our Silverstrike project. So this one, like each one of our projects, Silver Sand is in Potosi Department, Carangas is in Oruro Department, and Silverstrike is in La Paz Department. They're like provinces or states in Bolivia. And so this is our biggest land package, 45 square kilometers. Rio Tinto drilled a handful of holes there. There's artisanal dumps that are mineralized and littered throughout the entire project and project site. We started drilling the Silverstrike Central, which is in the bottom part of the image. Last year in a very small program, we hit in one hole 200 meters at a gram, including a high-grade subinterval closer to surface in hole 1. Hole 2, we scissored that hole, hit 200 meters at a gram, but it got an even better higher-grade subinterval in hole 2. And this is a snapshot. If we zoom into hole 2, there's a further high-grade subinterval along the contacts between the volcaniclastic units and the rhyolites, where you can see the volcaniclastics are grading 9 grams gold and the rhyolites are grading 0.2 grams gold. So there's a really interesting geological contact there that is a high priority target for us to step out on and follow up on once we are in a position where we can resume exploration at Silverstrike. But nonetheless, a very highly prospective piece of ground that we're really excited to get back in drilling once our internal situation permits. So to summarize, New Pacific, we've made large discoveries, silver and gold at Silver Sand, Carangas, and Silverstrike in just 5 years, which really highlight our ability to create shareholder value by carefully identifying projects, intelligently acquiring them, studying them thoroughly and methodically, and then wrapping that into a well-planned drilling campaign, which explains our extremely high success rate by the drill bit. And then we think that Bolivia is a country that still we're just scratching the surface on. And we've got a great team and a great presence and knowledge of the country. And so, we're going to continue to push forward on project identification in the country. Our capital structure, our market cap is roughly $350 million. That was US at the middle of this month. We had $17 million in cash at the end of the year. We're blessed with an extremely strong shareholder registry. 28% is Silvercorp. Our largest shareholder, Pan American Silver, our second largest at just under 10%. Management and board, 9%. 7% of that roughly is our CEO and founder, Dr. Rui Fang. And then we've got some institutional ownership, and the bulk is retail. And we're covered by 4 analysts currently. And again, this is all our success. Yes, Bolivia, the geology is great, but really it's people that make this what it is. And again, I mentioned our CEO and founder, Dr. Rui Fang. He's a serial mining entrepreneur, an exceptionally brilliant geologist, founded Silvercorp into what it is today, has created New Pacific into the company that I've just explained, which is something that continues to grow, and we're only, we think, in the early innings of Dr. Rui Feng's second major mining creation. Alex Zhang has been he's been the boots on the ground mind behind the exploration campaigns across our projects. Myself, who I gave an introduction to, our CFO Jalen Hernan, our in-country manager, one of the best geologists in Bolivia, who works for us, and Carolina is our VP Corporate Affairs, also a Bolivian, based here in Vancouver, and plays an instrumental role in bridging the gap between Canada and Bolivia. And last but not least, I'll just give you a quick highlight on our board. Again, some incredibly talented industry heavyweights. Terry Salmon, of former president, CEO, Salmon Partners, founder of that firm, is our chair, mining finance legend. Martin Waforn, I'll mention him as well. He's originally a representative of Pan American Silver, their senior vice president of technical services. And then Peter Megaw, the legendary geologist who won the prestigious Thayer Lindsley Award for his discovery of major silver deposits, is on our board and is continuing to encourage us to think bigger and bigger and bigger. He thinks that both our Silver Sand and Carangas deposits we're only scratching the surface on. So we certainly appreciate Peter Megaw's influence on our board.
Thank you, Andrew, for the presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I would like to mention the 2 pillars of the investment case for New Pacific Metals. The first one being getting silver sand into production, and the second one being the discovery of Carangas. Silver sand is a sizable pure silver mine in Bolivia, which will be producing on average 15 million ounces of silver in the first 4 years, as seen here. This would result in quite substantial free cash flows of $150 million at $25 an ounce silver. Note that the cost estimates are from the preliminary economic assessment released in the beginning of this year, but I have increased the operating cost by 15% and the initial capex by 10% in order to account for inflation. If we change the silver price assumption to say $30 an ounce, we can see that the free cash flows grow quite significantly, meaning that the leverage to the silver price is high, and given that New Pacific merely has a market cap of $400 million US, getting silver sand into production would be very meaningful for shareholders, especially since the free cash flows from the silver sand can be used to fund the development of Carangas. Thus, my questions will revolve around how New Pacific Metals will be able to advance and get silver sand into production. So firstly, you talked a little bit about yourself, but could you explain a little bit more about your background and how you came to join New Pacific?
Sure, yeah, great question. So this is my first corporate role. I spent previously 11 years at Sun Valley Gold, who's a major institutional investor in the precious metal space. And I started there as a little research associate, grinding out mine models, and worked my way up to the point where I was a portfolio manager. And as part of that role, I looked at every company in this space, whether it's early stage exploration, single asset companies, intermediates, seniors. So I know this space really well and began to develop an appreciation for what differentiates the successful companies from the unsuccessful companies. And what I've come to appreciate, and it's a point that Barrick's CEO Mark Bristow talks about, is that discoveries just aren't being made in this industry the way they used to. So if you look back in the mid 1990s, there was maybe 5 or 6 discoveries that were made every year. And in the mid 2000s, that number dropped to, call it 3 or 4. In the last 10 years, there's maybe 1 discovery that's made every year. And that's between both juniors, intermediates, and senior companies. And that's been a real problem for many juniors, is that they just don't have the projects that you need to create lasting and sustainable value in this industry, which is done by either making a discovery or taking a discovery and permitting it and financing it and building it and ramping it up. The hard work where you create lasting and tangible value. And so the question is, why aren't there more companies out there that do it? And it's because there's just not the discoveries that are going around. And New Pacific is a company that's made 2 incredibly impactful discoveries in such a short amount of time. And so there aren't really many companies out there that have those critical raw ingredients to create lasting value for shareholders. And so, from my seat as a portfolio manager, I obviously spent a lot of time and attention dissecting New Pacific Metals, and I got to know Rui, and we started chatting late last year about hey, what's your plan you've got this incredible endowment. What's the plan to move these abstract discoveries into tangible mines and create that value? You're going to need a big team, right? It takes an incredible amount of hard work. And he's like, well, we're actually putting that team together, right? He's, as a serial mining entrepreneur, he knew exactly what the next step was. And so we started talking about potentially myself coming on board. And so at the beginning of January, I hopped on a plane and spent 2 weeks doing my due diligence. I visited all the projects, met the in-country team, even met the president of the Senate of Bolivia. Rui was kind enough. He had a meeting scheduled. He brought me in, and this is the 3rd most powerful guy in the country. And I got to sort of read his body language, and as we presented to him the impact that silver sand was going to have, and he was blown away, sees eyes lighting up at the economic impact this project will have. And so that sealed the deal for me. And so, it was probably the next week I was in my new office here in Vancouver working with this fantastic team.
You have increased the net present value of New Pacific through discoveries and through de-risking of those. But still, there has been no upward trend in the share price for the stock since at least in the 2 last years. Why do you think that is the case, and what do you think will reverse that sort of trend or reverse it upwards?
Yeah, great question. And certainly at these levels, given especially the discovery at Carangas, from my perspective, the company represents compelling value. And when I joined the company, I put $250,000 of my own money into it. And I'm a younger guy. I've got a mortgage. I've got a young kid. So it's a personally meaningful stake for me. So I certainly believe in the potential at these levels. But the question as to why it hasn't gained traction. I mean, if you just look at the shareholder registry, we're very much institutionally underowned. For whatever reason, we haven't necessarily gained that institutional traction, and we've also only got 4 analysts that are covering the stock, and versus some of our peers that enjoy much richer valuations. They've got a much larger number of analysts that cover the company, and so both broadening the institutional acceptance as well as increasing the coverage from the analysts. Those are 2 important tasks that are the responsibility of myself and my team. So that's something that we're looking to continue to flush out, because if we don't have that coverage, then that's how big value creating initiatives like discovering a giant deposit, that's how those the knowledge of those discoveries is disseminated. And so, we think that we need to just continue to do a better job of getting out there and engaging with investors and analysts and folks such as yourself, retail, and really telling the story. I think, that's part of it. I think as well, it takes a long time to build confidence that a new discovery is real. I think it's just, Carangas is I don't know, it's almost 2 years old now from when we first started drilling it in the middle of 2021, which on a longer time horizon is still relatively in its infancy. And I think to be able to understand the economic significance can be a difficult conceptual exercise for many analysts. And that's why we think that the release of the resource estimate and the PEA will be such important events for the company to highlight that value, because it's on there. It's on there. The numbers are there for folks to see, and you can look at what that value is compared to our market cap, which is wonderful. That's the pro to it. Then the other side that we also got to be aware of is we also don't want, as I mentioned, like Peter Megaw keeps encouraging us, hey, there's more there, as we also don't want to be pigeonholed into as we've defined them, this is all we got. But we think on balance, it's important for us to, when we publish that resource and the PEA, that will very clearly demonstrate the value that we've unlocked by the drill bit at Carangas, and hopefully, that combined with continuing to disseminate the story to institutions and analysts and folks like yourself, that we should start to get recognition in our share price.
Let's move on to Silver Sands. The PA was put out in January, and you have said that you will put out the pre-feasibility in the middle of the summer. Roughly what months are we talking about? June, July, August?
My guess would be, like we're saying, mid, and my guess would be probably July, August would be my guess, sometime in the summer.
Okay, sounds great. And you're currently devising the environmental impact assessment. So what's the timeline on that, and when will you actually submit it?
Yeah, so great question. So I think the best way to think about it is we work backwards from the ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal is to have our environmental impact statement, we call it the DIA, so the Spanish translation. That's the document we need. So our mining claims give us the right to mine the subsurface, but we need our environmental permit before we actually go there. So our DIA is the document that we need where we can start building the project. And our consultants in the country have advised us that approval will take 3 to 6 months from the date on which we submit our environmental impact statement. So if we work backwards from the actual approval to submission of the document, that's 3 to 6 months. And then the key is, well, then when are we actually going to make this submission is the big question. And that's that's the part that is somewhat outside of our control, given that the most important piece of that submission is the community agreements that we need to sign, that we're actively engaging with and negotiating with the local communities. We think our internal best guess is that we can have that submission by the fall of this year. And then if we make the submission in the fall of this year, then you add 3 to 6 months on top of that, which would for the actual approval, which would put us sometime into the beginning part of next year. But that submission, and given that we're dealing with these local communities, and these are human beings, and we need to be careful to specifically guide to, we say we're going to get it done by X date, because we don't want to necessarily back ourselves into a corner. And during these negotiations, we want to be in a position where we can have very open and honest and fluid discussions with the community. So that's a bit of a moving target there, but our best guess is that we can have this completed by September of this year, and then that would add 3 to 6 months after that for actually receiving the permit. So hopefully by next year, maybe this time next year, we'll be in a position to be financing and starting construction at Silversand.
Given the 18 months construction period, you could be, if you started in mid next year, you would be in commercial production by the start of 2026. But in order to submit the DIA, you have to obtain a land lease agreement with the local community. So how are the local the relations with the local community at Silversand, and what are you doing to improve those and obtain the land lease agreement?
Yeah, great question. Engagement. So we've been in the country, we've been at Silversand since 2017. And so we've gotten to know all the folks in the community, and they know who we are. But up until this point, it's been very much like very just broad, non-focused discussion about what our intentions are. And so what's been such an important catalyst for us is releasing this PEA. So for the first time, we can actually talk to the direct impacts that this project is going to have. And so that's the document now that we're taking, and our next step in our process is to go door to door to all the local community members. And so we're breaking up into 4 different teams. And each team is going to be comprised of 3 individuals, including an independent third-party environmental consultant. And we're going to meet 1 family per day, 3 families per week. And so that's our next step in this process, is to really take, which has been a relationship that's been more abstract, and now it's finally we can talk to these direct impacts. And so we're going to do that on a door-to-door basis now with the communities over the next couple of months, and ultimately consolidate those learnings into what the next steps are going to be as far as hammering out the exact terms of the community agreement.
Has there been any protest, or how has it gone so far?
Yeah, I'd say so far everything's been right down the fairway, as far as I won't sugarcoat it. Like, this is an important economic development for these communities. I mean, this is really significant, not only for the country, but for these folks that live fairly small scale, simple lifestyles. So for them, it's an opportunity to make meaningful, life-changing money. And so with that background in mind, it's also important to recognize that Bolivia, as I mentioned, is a mining country. So mining at the Potosí mine, which is 30, 50 Ks away from our Silversand project, they've been mining there for 500 years. And so if you go to the town of Potosí, there's they'll have their annual parade, and folks will dress up with miners hats and miners belts. Like, the little kids will dress up in mining gear. And it's very much a part of their culture. So when we're having these discussions with these local communities, thus far it's been we haven't had to have philosophical debates about, is mining welcome in our country, which happens in a lot of different jurisdictions. It's very much we've been speaking a common language about how much is reasonable and fair compensation. So that's really the zone that our discussions have been in so far, and so that's encouraging. But ultimately, it's for our shareholders and for our stakeholders, it's really important that we get it right, and that's going to involve some intense negotiations and discussions. But that's, like I said, that's how we can create the value for everyone over the long term, is by diligently completing these exercises that so far I think have been fairly normal course for a project of this size and scale.
Once you have submitted the DIA, what will you do in the meantime before it will approval?
So before we submit, there are some additional studies that we have to complete. Like, we're finishing up our baseline environmental data collection as part of the submission. As we talked about, the PFS is something that we're continuing to complete in parallel, sharpening up a lot of the cost estimates in the PEA, both on the capex and the mining cost and operating cost front. So that's something that we're completing in the background here, which is 100% within our control. And we're doing our PFS study. It's going to be really cool. We're going to do it. There's a company out of China called BIGRIM, BIGRIMM. They're a major multinational engineering firm, and so they're going to be completing the pre-feasibility study in conjunction with and in connection with AMC, out of the well-known Canadian engineering firm or North American engineering firm. And so they're going to create a joint document that will have the best of both worlds, the East and the West. So it'll be the AMC will ensure that it's 43101 compliant, and having both those names on it will produce a document that will be financeable to both Eastern and Western corporates and potential capital providers. So that'll be the big one for us at Silver Sand. We're not drilling. Like I mentioned, we've put 550 holes into this deposit, 136,000 meters. So no more drilling. It's really just going to be this permitting exercise, community negotiations, and then the pre-feasibility study, which is kind of a sort of a taking care of business kind of. It's nothing particularly exciting or sexy, but it's something that you've got to do as part of the process of bringing a real project forward. And again, because we want to be able to finance and build this if that's the path that makes the most sense for our shareholders. And so it's not like we're just creating a document here that juniors can be guilty of, is creating a document that is really just a promotional document because they have no intention of building it. Like, we want to complete this pre-feasibility study with all the rigor and discipline, knowing that we might be the ones that build the project. So that's a big focus for us this year, in parallel with the permitting studies.
Because the plan is to build the mine on a pre-feasibility. Usually build it on a feasibility study, and there have been failures and successful ones as well. Or why won't you, devise a feasibility study?
Yeah, great question. So you're right. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily like, hey, you didn't create a feasibility study, therefore your project is likely to fail. It's not necessarily the classification of the study itself, because there's been many projects with feasibility studies that have failed. But there's also been great projects built on PEAs, and the most one that comes to mind from me when I was an analyst was the Escobal project in Guatemala, built by Tahoe Resources. It's just a fantastic mine. Now, they didn't get the community issues right and the government issues, but the mine itself was built on time, on budget, and it exceeded all expectations on a PEA, because it was built by a team that knew that they were going to be the ones to build it. So they completed the PEA document to the standard necessary for what is required to build a project. So I give you that background to just emphasize that it's not like you're destined to succeed or fail based on the study you produce. But as far as a pre-feasibility study goes, we're going to complete the pre-feasibility study assuming that we might build it based on that document. And so we're going to do all the work to a very high degree of rigor and evaluation But as I mentioned, part of my role is to help evaluate potential financing options for this project. And if we find, and I've started to talk initially with some financial advisors suggesting that some financial providers need, as a box checking exercise, a full feasibility study. And they won't even talk to you if you just got a pre-feasibility study. So that's something that we'll have to make a business decision on, and depending on what road we go down, whether we build this ourselves or someone else builds it or how we finance it, I think it's something that we're going to have to look at intelligently. But we might as well. I mean, we're a group that works really hard, and so we're going to complete the highest quality pre-feasibility study that we can that could build a project. But if it makes business sense to go to a full feasibility study, then sure, we'll consider it.
You're planning on starting construction in a little more than a year, roughly. So at what point would you start detailed engineering?
My guess would be we'd want to have visibility on that EIA submission and concluding our community agreements. So that's something that I think once we've been in a position to submit our EIA, I would think that that might be a time for us to start moving down that path, because that is an important, like if you were to do a forensics on projects that where the initial capex goes off the rails, time and time again, and I did this in my life as a portfolio manager and analyst, is like, what happened? Why was yours so successful or unsuccessful? And often the case is that the detailed engineering plays a big role in that. Like, you want to get that number as high as possible before you start construction. So yeah, that's definitely something that we're aware of strategically. But we're probably, my guess is that we'll want to look at that post completion of the pre-feasibility study, probably once we've made the business decision whether or not we're going to go with a pre-feas or to go to full fees. It'd probably be somewhere down the road. But yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we haven't come to a conclusion on yet.
Anyway, sounds great to have it in mind, because especially if you're going to build on a pre-feasibility study, you want to begin with a detailed engineering. Well,
you're absolutely right.
But are there any other critical permits, like, I don't know, explosives, water usage, or anything else that you have to obtain before beginning construction?
No, there's just some, mainly ancillary permits. Like I said, our plan for water is to collect rain, which otherwise isn't getting used. So it's not like we're going to be like sucking dry like a one aquifer that a major city is dependent on for its future health and prosperity. So from a water perspective, yes, we do need to get approval from the regulator, but it's not something that we foresee as we consider that to be more of an ancillary type permit. And then as well as bits and pieces, but really the biggest one is the community agreement. That's the most impactful one. Like in any mining project, you get the permit, and there could be 100 different ancillary permits that no one ever talks about because they all just happen in the background. And I would characterize the water permit as being of that nature.
Could you walk me through the different financing options that you're considering?
Yeah. So. Truth be told, it is a little bit early for us to really conclusively know how we're going to proceed. But nonetheless, preparation is key for everything. So we are continuing to build relationships and all the usual suspects, like traditional banks. I've been, since I joined the company, in my first 6 weeks, I was at 6 different conferences. So I've met a lot of potential banks and potential traditional lenders, capital providers, financial advisors on how to structure this thing. What are the different bits and pieces? Like we mentioned, the full feasibility study. Is that something we want to do? And so it could be a traditional bank that provides, let's say, if it's a $300 million capex, maybe 2/3 of that is debt financeable. I don't know. I'm just throwing numbers out there for the sake of illustration. But the other thing that is important with this project is that less than 2-year after-tax payback, which lends itself really well to being financeable. So that would be like a traditional lender, and then maybe there could be, and it seems like one of the cheapest forms of financing recently. Some of the IRRs on some of these streamer and royalty deals. I mean, that's also a potential that we could look at. Silver Sand itself, because the economics are so strong, like it could certainly handle the burden of an additional, if we were to put a stream on it or a royalty or something like that. I think where streams and royalties can become really bad words is on marginal projects where you're already at the 80th percentile on the cost curve and you put a stream on it. Now you're at the 99.9th percentile of the cost curve. Like, our silver sand all-in sustaining cost, $10 an ounce. We're at $22-23 silver today. Is certainly a project that could carry a modest burden there. So that's another option we can consider. And then there's converts, there's strategics, like projects like this. This is, like I said, one of the most significant global primary silver discoveries of the last decade, and just pure silver deposits are exceedingly rare. And most silver companies will start out, so-and-so silver, and then they find they can't replace it, their depletion, so they buy gold assets and change their name to so-and-so precious metals. And, that's fair enough. Like, they're just projects like this don't come around. So, maybe there's an opportunity for, some sort of a strategic to help us, with the project financing. So, and then there's traditional equity markets as well. Again, depending on, and so part of our job is to weigh all these different costs of capital, the pros and the cons. A senior management team in conjunction with our board. That'll be our job to really make the most intelligent assessment on how to push this project forward for the benefit of shareholders.
Well, I've been an exploration geologist for more than 40 years, primarily focused on silver, and I have been fortunate to work with people in a team that we've been able to make a couple of major discoveries, Juanicipio being chief among them, and that was done for Mag Silver. And a gentleman named Gordon Neal was the corporate VP for Mag Silver, and then he became the president of an earlier version of New Pacific. And he brought me in fairly early to take a look at silver sand initially. I think this is 2017. And so I went and looked at the project, really liked what I saw, and he asked me to become an advisor. And then I was asked by Ri Feng, the founder of the company, last year to join the board, which I did in December. And I should say, my focus is on exploration. And so I look at all of these projects, and the projects and the companies I get involved with have to have big upside potential for me to be interested. You have to put silver sand into context. Silver sand sits in the Bolivian tin silver belt, which contains the second largest silver deposit on the planet, Cerro Rico de Bolivia, which is only 35 kilometers away from silver sand. And there's a belt of big deposits that silver sand is one of, and they are fairly grossly underexplored. They have a lot of upside potential, and silver sand looks like a very large system which is not completely understood. So it's in a great neighborhood. We would call it elephant country, and there's a great example of similar geology very nearby. So the potential for how big it could be is very, very high. I think if you put the pieces of what is known of silver sand together, the geology is telling us that there is much more to that system to be found. So all of that mineralization came from somewhere. There's a source. There's a feeder that brought where the fluids came from and brought them into the areas that have been known so far. I think that the potential for exploration back in the direction of those feeders is very, very high. They're probably lie to depth, which would mean underground mining as opposed to the open pit mining, which is what's envisioned for the resource as known at silver sand.
Well, speaking of silver sand, so you have a 14-year mine life and you have a 20 million in sustaining capex over that period of time. That's not a lot at 1.4 per year. You have shorts and open pit and you have contract mining. But could you explain to me a little bit why it is so low and why you didn't need the lifting of the tailings again?
Yeah, great question. So if you were to dissect any open pit sustaining capex number, you'll find that the two most significant components, one is on fleet overhauls and rebuilds for the and that's so if you own your fleet, you're responsible for completing all those additional works. Versus for us, we've gone with a contractor fleet, so we don't have to. We're not constantly adding new trucks, and all the repair and maintenance is all being borne by our mining contractor and embedded in our operating costs. So there's really nothing associated with that in the sustaining capex. And the second being, as you mentioned, the second biggest piece is the tailings, which for a traditional tailings facility with wet tailings disposal, you've got to build your dam every single year. You have to build it up, and it's often that dam is located at the perimeter of the mine site, so they're exceptionally long hauls for trucks to deliver material to, and that is a significant expense that companies incur on an ongoing basis. But for us, because we are going to put the capital in to de-water the tailings effectively, then we just dispose of a dry powdery cake material, and so it's like a mechanical disposal. It's not like we're pumping and having to build these large engineered facilities that can accommodate the significant weight of the deposited wet tailings. So it really reduces significantly the ongoing commitment to sustaining capital by going with the dry stack facility in conjunction with the contractor mine. I think those would be the two biggest contributors to our ongoing sustaining capex.
Now that we have covered the first leg of New Pacific's investment case, we will examine the second leg of the investment case, Carangas. Carangas is a large mineral discovery that New Pacific made in 2021 and have since drilled close to 80,000 meters on. The plan is to put out a maiden mineral resource estimate in the late second quarter of this year and complete a PEA in the fourth quarter of this year. Here you can see the deposit, and as you can see on the top, there is a thick zone, roughly 150 to 200 meters of silver mineralization, plus some lead and zinc. Then there is a lead and zinc zone overlaying a thick breccia pipe of gold. And as seen, there have been several impressive drill results, such as 515 meters at 1.10 grams per ton of gold, and we estimate that the deposit should contain somewhere between 1 to 2 million ounces of gold and 200 million ounces of silver equivalent ounces in the overlaying zone. In other words, Carangas is big, and the advancement of the project will add a great deal of shareholder value, which is why the second part of the Q&A will revolve around Carangas.
It's a very large mineralized body. The area was originally discovered and exploited during the Spanish colonial era. So when you're out there on the property, there's all these little workings all over the place where very high-grade mineralization, actually not too dissimilar to what we see at Silver Sand, was exploited for quite a period of time. And what we've recognized is that, or what Alec Zhang has done a wonderful job of daylighting, is the fact that the silver mineralization sits on top of what appears to be a very large, I'd call it a pipe, but I don't really know what its geometry is yet, but a big vertically oriented body of mineralization, which is gold rich. And so you have a transition from silver to a base metal zone, lead zinc, and then below that you have up to 500 meters of plus gram gold. That's really remarkable. It also, when you think about it, it looks very much like what you would see just across the spine of the Andes to the west in Chile. So big deposits of this type are known in Chile, with the high silver transitioning to gold. People haven't really looked for them in Bolivia, but it's a logical thing to do. What IP is good for, or especially good for, is picking up disseminated pyrite. So fool's gold, it's a common alteration product within and around this type of ore body or mineralization body. And IP does a very good job reflecting that. So what you do is you use the IP to determine where the disseminated pyrite is, and then figure out within that body where the zone with the gold mineralization is. So it gives you a feel for the size of the ore body or the mineralization body, and where you would want to look within it for higher grade zones, for example. Well, I think it's important to understand that in exploration, it's dangerous to decide that what you have found is actually the best thing that's there. And so when you're looking at something in terms of a large integrated district, and when I say large, I mean big integrated ore systems can be 5 by 5 or 10 by 10 kilometers. So, and within that, you could have a multitude of mineralization centers, each one mineable in their own right. But you want to be very careful, especially doing blind exploration, which is part of what we're doing at Carangas. I mean, the gold zone that is getting everyone excited does not show up on the surface. What you see on the surface is silver on both sides, and then you see this broad valley where erosion has cut way down into the rocks, and so there's no surface expression of that gold zone. And we see very large areas of deep erosion around in the same general area that have no drill holes underneath them. So the first thing you want to do is you want to try to understand the overall system to make sure that where you're focusing your exploration is the best place. And it's nice to have one really good thing, but until you know that it's the best, you got to keep looking around. So the IP survey done on a much broader area gives us an idea of whether we have other mineralized centers to put drill holes into, and then see if they carry grade.
Let's move on to Carangas, your new flagship project, more or less. So there's a clear plan for Carangas this year. What could we expect in next year after you have released the PEA?
Great question. It's funny, nobody's actually asked that question before, and so you're kind of catching me off guard. But if I were to hazard a guess, so this time next year, we're going to have Carangas with a resource estimate and a PEA. And so really, I think there'll be, so option one is that we can continue drilling. Drilling is expensive, and this would be drilling in and around the existing discovery. We can potentially step out on the gold system at depth or the shallow silver system. That could be something that we could embark on. Drilling is expensive, and so we're very mindful of shareholder dilution given where our shares are trading. So that'd be like option one. Option two, as I mentioned, we're completing a large scale regional geophysical survey, which may highlight some interesting targets for us to drill. Again, looking for more Carangases in the district. So that could be something that we could work towards next year. Permitting, social engagement, as I mentioned with Silver Sand, what we found this year is that having that mine plan has given us the ability to talk to the direct impacts of the project with the communities, and really you get down to some substantive nuts and bolts kind of discussions. And so we could also begin to embark on those kinds of discussions at Carangas if we want to follow the path at Silver Sand. So that's something that we could look at doing next year. And perhaps taking it to a pre-feasibility study is something else we could do next year. I think those are kind of four options that we'll evaluate really in the context of the market. Like as we talked about, we haven't got really much value at all for the Carangas discovery in our share price. And so we want to be mindful of of where our shares are trading. If our shares are trading somewhere where we're actually getting recognition for the hard work that we're putting into Carangas, then that would lend itself towards adopting a more aggressive program towards advancing the project, with those 4 different options that I've just outlined on the spot here. And then maybe, depending on where the market is and how much credit we're getting for Carangas, if we're still, struggling to get that traction, then, maybe we don't spend as aggressively and we just focus on, targeted high impact projects, like maybe maybe completing the pre-feasibility study and the permitting, and doing a little bit less as far as flushing out the exploration potential. So that would probably be, and I think as well the context of the market and strategics. Like Carangas will be a bigger project than Silver Sand, and as I mentioned before, Silver Sand is a project that is very easily financeable and buildable by a project of our scale. Carangas, as well as maybe there's some strategic partners out there, or that's a path that maybe that's path 5 that we want to pursue next year. So I guess long story short, it's a little bit too early to really concretely say what our plans are, because to be quite frank, we don't have 2024 plans for Carangas, but I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor of hypothetically what they might look like.
Regarding drilling cost, if you include the assay lab cost, what is the drilling cost per meter, the total?
Yeah, it's around, I think the direct cost is $120 a meter, roughly. And then when you fully load that number, including some allocations from corporate head office, etc., I think you get in and around $200 to $220 a meter. And this is for diamond drilling. So, it's very, very competitive drilling costs, compared to industry peers.
You are doing an updated IP survey of Carangas and in the regional licenses. Say that you find a couple of large searchability anomalies. What would it take for you to pull the trigger and drill a couple of them?
Yeah, I mean, strong share price, it would certainly be one of them, because we're a pre-production company and we think we're grossly undervalued, and so want to be as judicious as possible with shareholder funds. But my sense is that, like, the IP is one tool. You can generate a lot of false positives with an IP survey. So my sense is that we're going to want to layer on additional clues. So it might have to be an IP anomaly paired with some interesting surface outcrop or structural observations, so on and so forth, and be more of a ranking and targeting exercise. Because my guess is we could probably generate like 100 different anomalies to drill, but then we'll want to take our guys and challenge our geologists on the ground to do a full, at the rock face evaluation. And then maybe, if we can rank and prioritize, there might be, once we layer on those additional geological observations, I would love to be able to drill a few of the best ones. I mean, why not do that? I had at the Roundup conference when I first joined, which is more of a technical conference here in Vancouver, there was a geologist that came up and she was just like wagging her finger at us, going like, guys, you gotta step out and test this potential. You're not gonna get credit for it, and it's someone's gonna take you out, and it's gonna be not good. So you gotta make sure you flush out the potential. It's like, okay, like, message delivered. And so, I mean, I think that we got to weigh that. It's something that we're really excited for, and I think it's something that it will be in the interest of our shareholders to do. But again, as I go, one of those slides, one of the last slides that I finished my presentation on, is what's made us successful is a very thoughtful, disciplined, and methodical approach to planning drilling targets. And so I wouldn't expect anything to be different here when we look at following up on some of the IP and regional stuff at Carangas.
Sounds great. So both Carangas and Silverstrike, for that matter, are situated 50 kilometers within the border to Chile and Peru in Silverstrike's case. According to Bolivian law, foreign entities are prohibited within that range. How is that working for Carangas and Silverstrike?
Yeah, great question. So, as you mentioned, foreign entities are prohibited from owning projects within that 50-kilometer range. And so, like, technically, we don't actually own the Carangas project. It's owned by a local Bolivian company owned by Bolivian nationals. And so what we've got is a joint venture agreement where we put up 98% we put up 100% of the capital in return for 98% of the economics. They've effectively got a 2% free carried interest. And so that's our joint venture structure at Carangas, which then, the law does not prohibit, that type of a structure, within the 50K zone. And as a case in point, they're on the Brazilian side, the Brazilian border on the eastern part of the country. There's a lot of farms, there's a lot of agriculture located in that 50K zone that are owned by Brazilian farmers, and our in-house, our in-country legal advisors, they've highlighted to us that this is the type of structure that is commonly used in the agricultural industry, in particular with these folks in the east part of the country. So from a I guess a continuity perspective, this is something that has been used before in the country, and so that's how we've structured our tenements at Carangas and Silverstrike as well.
Thank you. And regarding Silverstrike, exploration activities are paused for this year. Is there a longer term plan on when those would be resumed in the future?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned about Carangas, is like we need to be careful about putting shareholder money to work when we're not getting credit in the share price for it. Again, we talked about just Carangas not getting the value for it. Well, heck, Silverstrike's an even bigger case study in that regard. So I think we want to be in a market that's more certainly rewarding of the value that we're putting in there. I think that's aspect number one, but really the second aspect is just on internal bandwidth. Our company, because yes, we're growing. We got people like myself, and we're like I mentioned, our new deputy country manager that we hired, and amongst many other folks, we were just expanded into a bigger office space in Bolivia this year. But until we're really in a position to start ramping up and building Silver Sand and potentially Carangas, we're still a relatively lean organization, and so it's going to take us making the judgment call when we feel like we've significantly de-risked, in particular Silver Sand. It's really important for us to deliver Silver Sand properly. I think once we feel like we're in a position where we can deliver that project and where Carangas is in control, then we're probably going to be in a better position to revisit Silverstrike. Is the most important thing. We can't take our eye off the ball on what we've got in front of us at Silver Sand and Carangas. So that's something that we'll continue to make ongoing assessments of internally and as well externally in the context of whether we're getting value for any discoveries that we might make.
And great that you're cautious about issuing equity. But you will probably, with 70 million in the bank, you will probably have to raise equity this year. How much and when, ballpark?
Yeah, how much? Again, I don't want to put firm numbers out there, but this year our work plan is roughly a $15 million work plan with the permitting at Silver Sand, the pre-feasibility study, the Carangas drilling. This quarter will be the heaviest spend quarter of the year because we're drilling with 5 rigs at Carangas, and then the resource estimate, the PEA. So all this work plan with being Q1 front end loaded, plus corporate and sort of care and maintenance activities at Silverstrike, that's roughly a $15 million work plan. So by the end of this year, we're going to have very little cash left, and we're not producing. It's no secret that we'll need to raise a little bit of money. So how much we raise, I wouldn't expect it to be a meaningful dilution exercise. I would say maximum like maybe 10% of our shares, something like that, 5 or 10, something in that range. Again, more or less depending on, if we're in a major financial crisis and the financial markets are collapsing, then we're going to want to, limit. We'll probably hunker right down and do very little equity. And versus, if they're more supportable markets, then, we'll evaluate on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, maybe 5 or 10 million shares, something like that. Just enough to bolster the balance sheet so that we can have my goal is to whatever we raise in this next instance, be enough to take us through to the point where we can then it'll take us through to the point where we can, our next financing milestone will be to actually build Silver Sand. Like that's the way I see it lining up. That's the goal. So we're going to continue to strive towards that.
All of your assets are located in Bolivia, which in the last 2021's Fraser Institute report was ranked as one of the 10 worst mining jurisdictions in terms of policy perception due to high royalties, high corporate income taxes, and so on. How would you describe Bolivia as a mining jurisdiction, and why do you think it is ranked as low as it is?
Yeah, great question. So I guess the first point is that you mentioned the taxes and royalties. That's when we talk about a desirability of a jurisdiction. Folks look at when things go wrong in a jurisdiction. A lot of the times, it's when the mining company is promised to produce a certain level of taxes and royalties, and either the existing tax and royalty regime is that the company negotiated was just too advantageous for the miner, or the mine itself is just not a very good mine and it's not profitable and doesn't end up paying much in the way of royalties and income taxes. So it's funny because when you look at why Bolivia gets a bad score, it's like, yeah, because the taxes and royalties are relatively high. But I also look at that as a positive because it means that the government's going to get paid, and which creates much more alignment between the miner and the state. So I mean, I don't look at that as necessarily a negative. If you were to go into a jurisdiction because it had a high score because the tax rate's really low, to me that's a bit of a maybe a yellow flag, because it means that at some point someone's going to wake up and do some benchmarking against some of their peer countries and come back to you on that. So maybe point one is I think there's the 25% corporate income tax, 12.5% mining tax, which you get a 5% break if you produce doré, which we're going to do at Silver Sand. So it's 32.5% tax, and there's a 6% royalty. Of which I believe the royalty goes to the state and part of it goes to the municipality. So it's a mechanism that redistributes that royalty back to those closest to the mine site, which is really innovative. And so I think from that perspective, we're comfortable with it for sure. And then as far as what else could, Bolivia is a mining country, and that's the point that I keep coming back to is that I mentioned Cerro Rico's been there for 500 years, 30% of the national economy, 8th largest silver producer globally is Bolivia. So from a getting projects across the line perspective, like I said, it's like we just have these miners discussions. We're not having the philosophical, is mining welcome, yes or no type discussions, which is really great. And then you look around and there's perception and there's reality, and there's 3 major miners that have been operating in the country for the last 10 to 20 years. One of them being Pan American Silver, who's been operating San Vicente mine very successfully for a long time, and they were one of our founding shareholders and still own just under 10% of the company, right? If things were so tough, you think they'd be willing to double down on their exposure in the country? I mean, think a little bit critically about that fact pattern. And then the biggest one, the San Cristobal mine, which not that many people have heard of. I certainly wasn't aware of it before, leading up to just in the last few months. And that was it was a $1.8 billion US investment made by Sumitomo, the large Japanese trading house, 50,000 ton a day operation, one of the world's largest zinc producers, and that operated uninterrupted for it's been 17 years now through 3 different presidents in the country, with little to no hassle. I mean, it's just been a wonderful case study of what you can achieve in the country if you do things right. So, we sort of look at that case study, Pan American, ourselves, our own experience. Like we've been able to drill, like in certain parts of the world, you have to now get a permit to drill a single hole. Like we've been able to access our land without any issues and conduct these high impact drill campaigns. So we've had a great time in the country, and I think what again, imitation being the finest form of flattery, we came to this country in 2017, very few juniors operating, and now there's 6 or 10 of them now that you're picking up ground and raising capital and exploring the country. So we think that Bolivia is in a really unique window. Countries, these windows open and close in these countries. You look at 25 years ago, there were some pioneers that went to Peru, maybe 30 years ago, like Yanacocha, Newmont, when it was like Peru was this uninvestable country. Everyone painted it with a brush. And then over the next 25 years, I mean, there's some amazing mines that were built and operated, and tons of wealth was created for the countries, the host countries, the shareholders, the stakeholders. And then, you look at Peru today, where it's going through a bit of a reset as a country. And Bolivia really went through that 15 years ago, when Evo Morales was elected to power. And so we feel like there's a really interesting moment here in the country for companies like New Pacific to come in and really challenge existing beliefs. So hopefully one day we'll, as we continue to work on this, we'll be able to bring it up the rankings of the perception index.
I certainly hope so. I mean, at least you will probably get to answer the Fraser Institute's report, so that would at least help a little bit. You have on several occasions in this call mentioned that if someone else built it, and you have 2 large shareholders. You have Pan American with 9.4%. They have dropped their interest, but it still remains a larger one. And then you have, of course, Silvercorp with a 28.2% interest in the company. What's your relations to those shareholders?
Yeah, good question. And truth be told, it's not one that we lose a lot of sleep over. Like, ultimately, they're companies that have fiduciary obligations to their shareholders. And so, we're not privy to the discussions that go on with their senior executives and their boards of directors behind closed doors. So I'm only going to be speculating, just as you would, on what their ultimate intentions are. But, certainly the Silver Sand and Carangas are 2 globally significant discoveries that will attract interest from companies, Silvercorp, Pan American Silver, but also others. And so I would suspect that if anything were to happen corporately, whether it's those on our register or elsewhere, we're all going to just look at the plain hard facts and determine whether or not, I'm sure as investors, Silvercorp and Pan American will look at whether or not something makes sense if an offer is presented either by either of those parties or a third party, or we go ahead and build it. And they are both seasoned industry professionals and groups to know that there is a significant value lift that comes from financing and building a mine, and if they're patient long-term investors, they can enjoy that significant re-rate. Like, I know you look at what the success Pan American had holding on to their investment in Mavericks for a long period of time. That was very successful. And you look at names like Silvercrest, which they've taken it all the way up through the value curve and created value for long-term shareholders. And Lundin Gold, you look at that one, right? Newcrest was in there at 30%, and others, and I'm sure Lundin Gold got questions all the time about what's Newcrest going to do, and it's like, well, we can't control what they do. We don't run those companies, but we can put our heads down, and if we can deliver on our promises, we can create a lot of value for those shareholders and make them happy shareholders as one of several options. And that ultimately worked out really well for everyone at Lundin Gold. So yeah, there's a host of different options, and like I said, it's not something that we lose a ton of sleep on. The most important thing for us is to put our heads down and deliver on our key value objectives, and I think that everything else will take care of itself in due course.